India right now is around $2,500 per capita GDP. I think it actually was a big opportunity for India that we seem to be missing out.
Or how to create jobs for the masses. How will that be solved?
Pace for India to be another China is also shrinking. What we are arguing is that where we stand today.
Thank you, Geetika. Good afternoon. This is the session before lunch, not the session after lunch. So I'm sure people will start trooping in ways, sort of, I have got Dr. Rohit Lamba. He needs no introduction. He has written a hugely popular and successful book on reimagining India. And he's going to talk about with us. He will be here with about 45 minutes. So reimagining India, why do you think India needs to be reimagined?
Thank you, Business Standard. Thank you, AKB, for having me here. Just to set the stage about why arguably we need some reimagination. The tagline of, I think the Manthan is a developed India by 2047, right? So maybe we start with some some basic numbers, right? So India right now is around $2,500 per capita GDP. Just for context, China is around 13,000, Korea is around 35,000, right? So if we grow, and we can debate and discuss this, what you think our growth potential is and should be. If we grow at, let's suppose, our current potential over the last 30 years, which is around 6%, and there is absolutely no increase in our population, which is obviously a very, is a conservative and wrong assumption, but to argue against my case, we will double our GDP every 12 years, right? So by 2047, we are looking at a GDP of $10,000, right? So the idea, which is a very powerful idea that the Honorable Prime Minister has set for us, which is to be Viksit Bharat, or a developed country, by 2047, or at least be on that path. The Economist, whenever I see a new idea, I want to put numbers to it, right? So I haven't really, the only number that I've heard somewhere is the Honorable Foreign Minister's saying that it can be reasonably expected that India can be at $18,000 per capita GDP, right? So I'm just giving you two different, and that's probably what Viksit Bharat means. So there is a gap of $8,000 per capita GDP. Where does that come from? And we think to achieve that, to really be a robust middle-income country by 2047, India needs some reimagination.
Reimagination in what way? Can you give us a sense of what kind of reimagination do we need, and which areas? Can you list at least 3 areas where we need to reimagine India?
So India I don't always like theories of exceptionalism, but India is arguably an outlier in at least 2 dimensions, right? So if you take a long enough arc, by long enough I mean the last 200-300 years of global history, one in which it has been a consistent but poor democracy. It's a remarkable achievement, and we should all be proud of it. The fact that despite being very poor, India has managed to be consistently democratic. The second way, so this is in the political realm, the second way in which India has managed to be an outlier is there is a standard, arguably cookie-cutter route that most countries in Western Europe and then later in East Asia took for their development trajectory, which is called, after the famous development economist Arthur Lewis, is called the Lewisian structural transformation. Right? That broadly goes like the following, that you develop some kind of surplus in agriculture, you vest that surplus into low-skill manufacturing, and then you start seeing greater urbanization, more factories coming up. People, because of urbanization and other savings and investments that society does, the labor force gets even more skilled, and eventually you transform to high-skill manufacturing and high-skill services. right? The US and the UK did this over at least even the first phase of the structural transformation over 100 years almost. They grew very slowly. And why I gave the context of the politics in the beginning is that unlike what we are made to believe, they didn't become democracies overnight. They gave freedom to their people very slowly. What is remarkable about China, Korea, starting from Japan and then Korea and China, is that they achieved this first phase of structural transformation very quickly in almost 3 decades. Right? So they managed to transform their economies from primarily agrarian into basically low-skill manufacturing juggernauts. And Japan and Korea have arguably made the transition to high-skill services, and China is also doing that now. India was an outlier in this realm because that's what the data suggests, and that's kind of anecdotally we can see as well, that it goes from largely an agrarian economy to an economy that specializes, and I would use the word specializes in the context of the fraction of the sector of the economy that produces the largest value and also the largest employment to be services. In fact, India specialized in high-skilled services. We all know the era of the 90s and how IT boomed and IT-enabled services boomed in India. And this story has kind of continued, right? Now, there is a view, and the view is not just economic, it's a political economy view that India perhaps got it wrong. That India should have pursued that path, that India may have become democratic too early, and India may have chosen the wrong route of following services as opposed to low-skill manufacturing is the primary component of the economy, and it is time to kind of turn the bus back, right? And in the book, and then in various other contexts, the premise that we are putting in that this view is flawed, or at least not entirely correct. That both the politics and the economics of India, you can argue in the past may have been a bug, but going forward, we should treat both of them as features rather than bugs of the India story. So we need to double down on both, in some sense, the way our politics has been going over the last 60, 70 years, and also double down on the fact that we have managed to become, for historical accidents one can argue, have developed a specialization in services. The reimagining that is required is in what route, what path India should pursue going forward.
You don't think agriculture can be reimagined?
Agriculture can be reimagined, but see, again, there's a push and pull force, right? We tried the push force, and we kind of failed. There is absolutely no doubt in our minds that agriculture needs to be reimagined big time. However, given the way things are, given the political economy of the situation, the pull force might be more efficient. Mm-hmm. Getting other sectors of the economy to pull labor out of agriculture. So if you see the data, what is interesting is that even before the pandemic, people had started moving back into agriculture. Now this for a developing country should be very disappointing. So yes, reforming agriculture, and there are lots of great ideas. We don't lack great ideas. Professor Gulati, Professor Chand, all of them have come up with brilliant ideas about how India can and should aspire to reform agriculture. But at least in the medium term, while the politics and the political economy plays out, I think the pull factors might be more efficient than push factors.
Okay. You said the transitioning to the services by sort of skipping a stage of sorts, in a sense going beyond manufacturing. Has any country, apart from your model of India can do, any other country in the world achieved that?
So the short answer, I think, is no.
Yeah. So what gives us the hope that we can do it?
Right. So if you look at China, for instance, no country had did what China did, right? Like basically pull out 400, 500 million people out of poverty in 30 years. And it's not that Japan hadn't become a manufacturing capital of the world, or had become a manufacturing powerhouse. It's just that the way China did it, right? Becoming literally the manufacturing capital of the world hadn't been done before. And also China continues to be an outlier in the sense that despite achieving a robust middle income status, it is not extending freedom to its people in the way that other countries did, right? India also is already an outlier, as I argued, that in being a poor and consistent democracy. So what we see is that there is no reason, just because there is no short-term historical precedent, that India cannot do this, because anyways we think that India is already doing it in some way. Now, one can ask ourselves, why didn't we do it? And there broadly are three reasons. One is India never had the kind of moderately skilled labor force, educated labor force that China did. Because India was a democracy, it couldn't suppress wages and market force, and political forces the way China did, right? And infrastructurally, India could never build infrastructure at the pace that China could for a variety of reasons, right? Now, going forward, why we think this path holds a lot of promise is because, first, India is at least in the low-skill manufacturing realm, India is no longer competing like China was with, let's say, the Japanese or even the Korean or the American labor. India is still competing with the cheap Chinese, relatively cheap Chinese labor, the Vietnamese labor, the Bangladeshi labor, and so on. Okay. The second issue is that firms are changing their supply chain strategies dramatically because of geopolitical reasons. So you'll keep hearing, if you read the Financial Times, you'll keep hearing the word reshoring, nearshoring, and so on, right? So globally, this is very much on the mind of various firms that they need to actually bring supply chains closer to home. So the space for India to be another China is also shrinking. Thirdly, manufacturing itself is changing rapidly. So when you think of the quintessential manufacturing product, you think of, let's say, a car, you think of Henry Ford and a supply line with thousands of people working in a factory. That notion of what is a final manufactured good is also changing dramatically because there are lots of intermediate services that are embedded in manufacturing. So what's an example of that, right? We're trying to set up chip fabrication plants in India, and we should come to that. A large part of the value added of chips is actually the design, which India is already doing. By various estimates, 20% of chip design happens in India. It's just that we don't own the intellectual property because it's being done for NVIDIA, Qualcomm, etc. If you think of the iPhone, the largest value added of the iPhone is actually in the design, the conception, and then in the allied services, the app store, and so on. The actual manufacturing has very low value added, as you can see. Foxconn being $50 billion value and Apple being 60 times at $2 trillion, right? So manufacturing itself has changed. Tesla, for example, has around 60 million lines of code written into it. So the future car, the cutting-edge electric vehicle is going to look more like a mobile phone in terms of how it's manufactured than like a Henry Ford car. So manufacturing itself is changing rapidly, where services or services allied with manufacturing have a huge component in it. And finally, massive labor arbitrages are emerging, not per se in low-skill manufacturing, but actually in direct services, right? So why are the global capability centers doing so well? Is because one of my students or one of Raghu's students in Pennsylvania or Chicago, when they get out of a university, they need to be paid around $150,000, $200,000 as a starting salary in various variety of these firms, right? You can hire the same person. Arguably they can do about 75 to 80% of the work that they're doing in the US at $40,000 in Bangalore. So the labor arbitrage is massive. Okay? So, and India has a head start in all of these pieces of the puzzle, which we call basically the new globalization of services. Right? India has a head start because of English language. It has a head start because it kind of knows how to do services. It has a head start because, actually, even within the IT-enabled services, we have been going up the value chain and so on. There is a legitimate question, and we can discuss that one can ask, well, but not everybody is going to be an engineer, not everybody is going to be a doctor, not everybody is going to be doing high-skilled services, so where are we going to generate the large amount of jobs from? And we can discuss that. But we do want to pivot the thinking away from this cookie-cutter model that this is the only way. We're not saying this is not a way. This is not the only way for India to grow. And the idea was to kind of shake up this thinking a little bit, that actually India is traversing a different path and potentially can be really good at it.
Well, we'll come to the job issue, but let me first come to the question of education. In a sense that if you want to transition to this services and design-led services, manufacturing company activities, what role does education have? And do you think we need to reimagine our educational system as well? Otherwise, the fear is that we might end up doing this a low-end coolie job and not the real job which will give you value-added earnings going forward. So is there a danger in what we need to do our education system?
You know, there is a huge danger. So in, you know, and we are very, very worried about that. That's, you know, where sort of the second part of the book is kind of obsessively focused on. And there is an easy part of that discussion, which is neither dependent on manufacturing or services, right? We just need to get basic primary and secondary education right. We are very, very far away from being able to produce, we're reasonably far away from being able to produce a fit and healthy and an able workforce that will contribute positively, like that will actually allow us to become Viksit Bharat by 2047, irrespective of whichever path of development we choose. Right? So 30 to 35% of our children are still malnutrition, according to the last family health survey that was done in 2019. The dropout rates are going back up again after COVID massively. You look at the data from Jharkhand, Bihar, and it tells for a sobering story. You know, everybody knows here about the USR reports or even other kinds of surveys that have been done about learning outcomes. So even if you get children to school, how well are they learning? Are you being able to produce learning machines by the age of 10? And we are not doing very well at it. And there's actually very good evidence that by the age of 5 to 6, if the child's health and learning skills haven't developed to a certain level, then a large part of their human potential is actually sadly lost. There's papers after papers in biology, in economics, in other social sciences that argue that quite convincingly. So this is something that we need to really be kind of obsessed with. And it's not about this government or the previous government. You can see there's a general trend about how much focus we both put as a society and also as intellectuals and media on this topic, right? So you see, for example, in these kinds of discussions or in these kinds of fora, how often do you see, we always have, the honorable finance ministers or the honorable ministers looking after infrastructure, physical infrastructure. How often do we get to question and counter-question people who are looking after our education, right? Just as a sufficient statistic to keep in mind. And we can talk about higher education as well, but really getting primary education right and health of our children right is almost independent. It needs to be done on a war footing, but it's almost independent actually of which growth path India chooses.
So that's a necessary imperative, you were saying. Education
it's
and health.
The primary constraint. Like, I think we need to stop obsessing over the next intersection in Gurgaon and how much money will go into that flyover. We were at that stage where, I'm not saying physical infrastructure is no longer a binding constraint, but in our development path today, the biggest binding constraint is the human capital of our demographic dividend.
And right now, this focus is missing.
It's massively missing, and there's data after data, and anecdotally we can see, right, that many industrialists, for example, when we were writing the book and talking to people, told us that yes, a labor force in India might be cheaper than China, but adjusted for skills, actually Chinese labor is still cheaper.
Okay.
Right. So adjusted for skills mean that how efficient is this labor or how well trained this labor is. So I'm willing to pay them 10,000 rupees more actually because of the fact that they're just more skilled.
So how much is the government to be blamed, or how much it is the industry to be blamed?
It's a complicated question, right? So it's not again, as I said, it's not about this government per se. Obviously, this government.
No, when I say government, I mean
the state in general. I think it's a general fate. I mean, you can go back to Myron Wiener, right? He had this classic text, his former social scientist at MIT, where he argued that the reason India hasn't been able to, and this I think he wrote it in the 90s, hasn't been able to get primary education right is because inherent hierarchies in the society. That somehow at the end of the day, the elites just don't feel strong enough to push primary education as a primary policy agenda. And this is what I was saying, that this has been true for successive governments, actually, even since the time of independence. The industry can be blamed to some extent, but I would still put it fairly at the squarely at the floor of policy imperatives, because where do you learn outside school? It's actually at work. But because for years our labor laws were so constrained, and obviously we are improving them now, that the idea that you learn at work was almost absent, right? So there's actually very good evidence to suggest that there is some kind of optimal middle path or sweet spot where you can maximize learning at work. So what do I mean by that? India has reached a stage where either you are hired immediately with tenure, like in a government job, right? You can never be fired, or you're completely at the other extreme where there's contract labor. Right? You're almost hired on a daily basis or a monthly basis or a yearly basis, and the moment there is any threat of you becoming permanent, you're fired. And both instruments are wrong. What we need is short-term tenure with the ability to grow and learn at work. But there has to be some repercussions of poor performance where you can be fired.
Okay, we have come to a very interesting stage in our discussion where reimagining India, making it a services-led economy, is critically dependent on both education and health. We will continue our discussion, but in the meanwhile, let me tell you that we will come to you if you have any questions. So start thinking about some questions if you have. Dr. Lamba would be very happy to answer them. So let me come back to your point on jobs. Mm-hmm. If this is the path that you have chosen for India as an economist, why will this $1 million question of how to create jobs for the masses, how will that be solved?
So again, I'll come back to the primary ingredient first, and which is the training of the labor force, right? And I cannot emphasize this enough, that this is a lazy way of thinking that fixing education is too long term. No, it's not. It's today. If getting higher education right, the payoff comes. Obviously, there is a political economy mismatch that you have to go to elections every 5 years. But at the level of policy, right, like getting trained, according to VBox that does the India Skills Survey, 50% of our labor force as of, that is coming out of colleges as of 2023 is not employable, right? So you cannot, hope to, if you don't have learning machines, they will also not learn at work to some extent, right? So there's some hope lost just by not training your labor force well, and we can come to how to have a deeper discussion on the higher education system. Where do we get jobs from? So at no point in time, and I think I'm kind of glad, but also kind of sad that the debate has sort of been framed as manufacturing versus services. There is some truth to that, but at no point in time are we suggesting that you don't do manufacturing or you don't do low skill manufacturing, right? A lot of jobs are going to come from low skill manufacturing, which is great. The debate comes into where should we be focusing all the energies of our government or industry only on designing industrial policy for low skill manufacturing, right? So even I think there is a rigid thinking, I think, which is we are prisoners of the past experience of other countries, especially East Asian countries. There's a bit of China fetish that the only way jobs are going to come out on the factory floor. I think that is wrong, because what we can already see from experience of many countries, like even today the US or Western Europe, is that once you capture a large part of the value of products, jobs come. They may not be the jobs that you have in mind, but they come, right? So very good recent research by economists at Johns Hopkins and World Bank suggests that for every one high-skilled job, a services job that India has created, 4 to 5 low-skilled services jobs have been created around it. Also, as you double down on good services job, but also high-skilled manufacturing jobs and jobs at the intersection of services and high-skilled services and manufacturing, you would hopefully, if we get policy right, also be looking at greater urbanization. That already is going to bring many jobs that are non-existent right now, because India is still way too rural for its for its development aspirations. Jobs are also going to come through many other, allied services like tourism, hospitality, healthcare, education. One of the shortcomings that I think, again, this is almost a poverty of our ambition and aspiration, is that we view education and health, for example, as, when I used to work at the Ministry of Finance, it used to really get me angry, as social sector, right? Like as if like this is some kind of, and we never imagined, given the head start we had in higher education and the head start we had in medicine education, that we should have by now been training the engineers and doctors of not just India, but of entire kind of developing countries. Like students from Africa, from East Asia should have been coming to India to get their higher education. This also generates jobs.
Okay.
Right? So jobs are going to come, but I think there is a laziness in thinking, and there is this East Asian or China fetish that is crept in, that this is the only way to get a large number of jobs, which is the factory floor.
But you also believe that India should not be China 2 or for China,
Absolutely not. So, it's not that there's anything wrong. I mean, what China did, to some extent, what Deng Xiaoping, there is this amazing biography of Deng Xiaoping that I highly recommend all of you guys read, by Ezra Vogel, I think. It's a fat book, but, which is kind of remarkable what China was able to do. But we are not China in our temperament, in our political systems, in our diversity. So we have to take all of those things along and then ask ourselves, what is the way for us to grow at the fastest possible pace? And many people, have argued, including, Arvind Subramaniam, that it's not that we are going to be China. What we should aspire to be is, even in the manufacturing sector, is to, can we reach, for example, 8 to 10% of global trade in manufacturing? We're nowhere close to that, right? So we can't hit Chinese numbers, but it's good to have some aspirations. But I think the key is going to be, what is the right mission for us? What is the right mixture for us in terms of services and manufacturing to create enough jobs? I mean, I'm sure all of you guys looked at the data this morning that the Hindu has reported from the ILO recent survey, where it's showing that 83% of the unemployed in India are young. It's kind of staggering,
and
right?
it has gone up from 35%.
And the number of those who have higher education, secondary or higher education, has gone up from 35 to 67%. Right?
Right.
So,
yeah. So, but tell me one thing, that why do you think that this kind of a growth journey needs to be supplemented or complemented by nurturing an argumentative society? I mean, the common belief is that if you have an argumentative society, then the growth processes slow down. There's a slow and torturous path. You can't be a China then. You can't have a 10% growth year on year. So the idea of argumentative society is frowned upon on that reason. What's your
I think answer? Again, there is a reasonable thesis one can have, and let's take the morality out of it. Should you have freedom? All of us should have freedom. We're sitting here because we have some freedom, right? But even just from an economic perspective, and then I'll come to the more moral perspective on this, is that I think one can have a reasonable view that if India had those discussions some people have over chai or are doing adda, if only we were more authoritarian, we could have been like China. And so one can have some view about it that I think first the pitfall with that is that we all hope we end up with some Deng Xiaoping or Lee Kuan Yew, and not everybody does, right? So I think the problem is that what we are arguing is that where we stand today, right, what our growth aspiration should be, and the growth path that, if you buy our argument about what is the growth path that we should pursue, then in that model, actually being democratic is a big boon. Let me give you a couple of examples, right, to make it concrete. You probably won't care as a consumer in the West where your vacuum cleaner or your washing machine comes from. But you would care while sharing your data with a financial firm, or let's say, if we are manufacturing electric vehicles which are keeping track of your or driving abilities, you would care where all this information is going. Is it going to a firm in an autocratic country like Russia, let's say, or even China, or is it coming to is it coming to firms which are governed by rule of law, of digital privacy and so on in a democratic country? And this is not just abstract thinking, right? Literally, half of the global turmoil in the chips industry is happening because of security concerns.
Okay.
Right? So if we can credibly communicate to the world that we are governed by a rule of law that values freedom and let's say things like data privacy, then we actually create an environment of property rights. By property rights, I mean, let's say, digital property rights that makes it very attractive for companies and consumers to come to India.
Okay. Let me provoke you a little further. I mean, India's growth rate is good. We have crossed 8.4% last quarter. Inflation is coming under control. The external sector is fairly stable. Even unemployment numbers are coming down. So what is going wrong? What is right and what needs to be done? What are your concern areas?
So like in any stage of development, right? Like India, and we say this quite categorically in the book, that India has had many success stories over the past 10 to 15 years. Infrastructure is one of them. Getting the digital stack right is one of them. GST, whichever way it was implemented eventually is, most economists would argue is a welcome reform. And there is a sense in which India is getting the plumbing right to now fly. Mm-hmm. And I think this is good from a confidence building perspective, but actually the hype that is being created around this is very problematic in some sense, in a lot of ways. And even if we look at the GDP numbers, most people have argued, most reasonable people have argued that one shouldn't think of India's growth potential as being 8%. There are a variety of reasons. We can go into the detail of whether it's a GDP deflator or the distance between the GVA and the GDP this year, whether we really believe that India is actually growing at 8%. I mean, just look around you. Is India growing at 8%? I don't want to be informal by saying just look around you, but there is a deep sense in which we are not. I think it is true that we have a certain level of macroeconomic stability to now fly, but I think this is where we are differing. Is that we're actually very worried. I'm actually very worried that a certain set of complacency is setting in, despite all the things that I just argued, that India is just not positioned because the basic plumbing when it comes to human capital, or even actually in terms of economic policies, is just not there for us to be able to have, and I think one of the most tragic things, both as human beings at an individual level, but also as at a collective level as a society or even as a nation, is if you don't have aspirations, sometimes you go along with life putting your head down. But once you build hope and aspirations and you do not have the ingredients to fulfill them, it can lead to a lot of problems. Mm-hmm. And we can try to be provocative, and one way of your provocative question is I would turn it around and say we must not be complacent, because from where I see, the economy is coasting along at some 6% growth rate, 6.5 maybe, and that's simply not enough. And even that, if we don't address the so-called K-shaped recovery of the economy, that if more and more people don't participate in the growth story, it's just not going to be sustainable.
Okay, let me shift the scene a bit. If you look around in the world, industrial policy is by and large getting back. But in India, industrial policy is back along with tariff controls. How do you see this scenario, and how do you think it will pan out? Good for India, bad for India, and how should India get out of this situation if it is bad?
So I won't. It's not only in India, right? So if we take a global perspective, as you're saying, that US is doing the CHIPS Act, and so I think it actually was a big opportunity for India that we seem to be missing out, is to actually go their own path rather than actually succumbing to the peer pressure of industrial policy. Again, all industrial policy is not bad, right? Nowhere in the book are we saying that, and I definitely don't believe that all industrial policy is bad. But one must be really worried. Whenever I talk to industry people now, they just, they somehow, everybody talks about getting a subsidy. The dynamism that the India growth story had in the 2000s seems to be missing. And I was recently in a discussion with some industrialists and so on, where the discussion has gone now to doing industrial policy at the product level. This should really scare us. We've been there before. We've really been here before, right? In the 70s and 80s, and we know how it turned out. Now, having said that, one can argue that, what's wrong in giving a PLI to Foxconn to come manufacture iPhones in India? And I think, I have some sympathy to that view, but not beyond a point, because for industrial policy to work, one must take global lessons, right? And ask ourselves, what are the ingredients does India satisfy? Like, so often we throw around Korea as an example of a successful industrial policy. Korea was absolutely ruthless in how it implemented industrial policy, in letting go of losers. Okay, it's not. We are largely giving subsidies to well-established large firms, which is not necessarily the right way of incentivizing innovation. Right? Even if you look at, let me give you a concrete example. One can have a reasonably different view than me about this, but let me put forward my view on the chips stuff. Right? We are putting 76,000 crores in setting up 2 or 3 chip plants. I think one by Tata and one by Micron. How long will it take is to be seen, and whether it gets materialized. But suppose you can have a reasonable view that for security reasons and for the way the global economy is going, India should have a say in the global production of chips. I think that's a very good objective to have. So you sit together in a room, a bunch of intelligent people, and you ask yourself, how should we go about doing this? Well, the first question as an economist I would ask is, where is your comparative advantage? I just mentioned that 20% of all chip design is already happening in India. Mm-hmm. About 1/3, sometimes even more, value added of the final chip that goes in your phone, in your cars, is actually at the design stage, right? NVIDIA does not manufacture chips. Qualcomm does not manufacture chips. TSMC does in Taiwan, right? Now, there's actually also, I've been told that about 40 to 50% of chip designers of the world are Indian or of Indian origin. Chip design is significantly less capital intensive than chip fabrication, right? Which is actually putting the chip together. It is extremely capital intensive. But that's why we are spending 76,000 crores as subsidies. Just for context, India's entire higher education budget for a year, all the IITs, Indian Institute of Sciences, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, everything is 44,000 crores last year. Just for context. So we want to put 76,000 crores. It's not as if India shouldn't aspire to fabricate chips, but if I was to enter this very important industry of chips, I would actually, to me it seems like a no-brainer, like as an economist, that I should try to enter as an Indian as a chip design phase. We have a comparative advantage, we have a head start, we have the expertise, and it requires significantly less capital to start out, and later on we can aspire to have.
They're picking the wrong areas.
That's what when industrial, it's whenever you pick and choose sectors, even within the product, right? Like, I'm not even saying across products. It's not obvious to me that bureaucrats are the most competent people to do that. So if you had, I don't know, if you had asked people in the industry, if you asked economists, they would say you should, if at all you need to nudge industry in a direction, you should try to nudge it in the direction where we have a comparative advantage, especially if there is a view that other sectors in the supply chain can be pulled up using that entry point.
It was a wonderful session. Thank you very much for being so candid and taking the trouble of answering the questions with such detailed information and your thoughts. If I were to sum it up, it will be an impossible task. But I can say in terms of what would be the first sentence of my story, which would be that India can be reimagined provided we take care of education and health and probably jobs. So will that satisfy you?
Yeah, and just as a closing remark, I think given what is happening around us, I think we must not forget that that it's very difficult to build institutions and very easy to fritter them away. And I think because we are here at BS Manthan, and I'm very honored that Nainan is here. Like it takes what is remarkable that what you guys have done is built a very strong brand and an institution over 50 years. We cannot take this for granted. It makes a lot of effort, a lot of churn to actually first build an institution and then to maintain quality as you guys have over the last 50 years. So congratulations on 50 years, and and
Thank
hopefully
you, Rohit.
I'll meet you again at the end of the next 50.
He will be here. Those of us who are here, we can always talk to him. I'll hand it back to Gitika.
I'll be here at the 52. Thank you very, very much for all those kind words for us at Business Standards, and all of you got so many gems to take away. Thank you, Rohit Lamba, and thank you, Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya. Please come together for a group photograph.